She was the last of the Great Three, the last dragon alive who had known Aegon the Conqueror, the last creature breathing who had felt the weight of old Valyria's legacy in her own blood and bones. She was Vhagar, and across nearly 200 years of history, only 5 riders ever called her theirs. To understand Vhagar, you must understand where she came from. She was one of the 3 dragons brought to Westeros by House Targaryen during the conquest, the 3 that changed the world. Balerion the Black Dread was the largest, the most fearsome, the one that melted the Iron Throne itself. Meraxes was elegant and deadly, and Vhagar was the youngest of the 3, but she was still a dragon. Her first rider was Visenya Targaryen, sister-wife to Aegon the Conqueror, and arguably the most dangerous woman in the history of the 7 Kingdoms. Where Aegon's other sister-wife, Rhaenys, was warm and beloved, Visenya was cold, calculating and utterly ruthless. She was a warrior first. She carried Dark Sister, a Valyrian steel blade, and she wasn't afraid to use it. She had learned the old arts of Valyria, dabbled in sorcery, and wore armor where other queens wore silk. She and Vhagar were a perfect match. During the Wars of Conquest, Visenya and Vhagar flew across the kingdoms alongside Aegon and Rhaenys. Together, the 3 dragons and their riders broke the resistance of lords and kings who had spent lifetimes believing themselves unconquerable. The Field of Fire, where all 3 dragons flew together, killed 4,000 men in a single hour. Vhagar was part of that. She was part of the burning of Harrenhal. She was part of the flight over the Vale that convinced Queen Shara Arryn to surrender without a fight, her young son Ronel on Visenya's lap as Vhagar circled the Eyrie. She carried a queen who forged a kingdom. Visenya outlived both Rhaenys and Aegon. She spent the last years of her life on Dragonstone, old, hardened, still mounted on Vhagar into her late years in a way that would have broken a lesser woman. When Visenya finally died, in the year 44 after the conquest, Vhagar did not eat for weeks. She was alone for the first time, and she would remain riderless for nearly 3 decades. The next rider was Prince Baelon Targaryen, the second son of King Jaehaerys I, who history would call Jaehaerys the Conciliator, the Old King, the greatest monarch to ever sit the Iron Throne. Baelon was everything a Targaryen prince was supposed to be. Tall, strong, golden-haired and violet-eyed, with a laugh that filled a room. He was called Baelon the Brave, and his dragon was the ancient, enormous Vhagar, now old enough to dwarf nearly every other living dragon, but still hungry, still powerful. Baelon's time with Vhagar was defined by his role in Jaehaerys' court and the promise he represented. He was named Prince of Dragonstone, heir to the throne, after the death of his elder brother Aemon. He married his own sister, Alyssa. They had children together, including a boy named Viserys and another named Daemon. Yes, those Targaryens. Baelon was beloved by the small folk in a way few princes ever achieve. He jousted, he feasted, he flew Vhagar over the city, and the crowds would cheer below. But Baelon died young, of a burst belly as the Maesters called it, an internal rupture. He was in his early 30s. He died not on dragonback, not in battle, but in a bed, in pain, despite every effort to save him. Jaehaerys, the old king, never truly recovered from losing his son, and Vhagar was riderless again. The third rider was the most unexpected. Laena Velaryon, daughter of Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, the greatest sailor and admiral in the history of Westeros, and Princess Rhaenys Targaryen, granddaughter of Jaehaerys himself. Laena was considered one of the most beautiful women of her generation. She was strong-willed, a dragon rider, and she chose Vhagar. By this point, Vhagar was enormous. She was old enough to have been alive during the conquest. She had outlived 2 riders. In size, she was second only to the memory of Balerion the Black Dread. Claiming her would have been a feat for any dragon rider. Laena claimed her anyway. She married Prince Daemon Targaryen, the rogue prince, brother to King Viserys I. Together, Laena and Daemon were perhaps the most glamorous, dangerous and charismatic couple in all the known world. He rode Caraxes, the blood worm. She rode Vhagar. They had 3 children, twin daughters, Baela and Rhaena, and a third child that did not survive. That third pregnancy killed Laena. The birth was difficult, brutally so. The maesters could not save both mother and child. Facing a slow and agonizing death in childbed, Laena Velaryon made a choice. She dragged herself from her bed. She walked, or crawled, to where Vhagar rested. She called her dragon's name. She commanded Vhagar to breathe fire upon her. Vhagar, it is said, hesitated. Dragons are not bred to kill their riders, but Laena was insistent. Whether she succeeded, whether Vhagar actually burned her, or whether Laena collapsed before that moment came, the accounts differ. George R.R. Martin himself leaves it somewhat ambiguous in the source text. What is not ambiguous is that Laena Velaryon died at Driftmark, and that her death set in motion a chain of events that would drag two branches of House Targaryen into the most devastating civil war in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. After Laena's death, Vhagar sat riderless on Driftmark, and that moment of vacancy is where the dance of the dragons truly began to ignite. Aemond Targaryen, the third son of King Viserys I, had never had a dragon. His brothers and sister had theirs. Aemond had nothing. He had been mocked for it. He had tried to claim the dragon Dreamfire and been burned for his trouble. He was, in the politics of the Targaryen court, a prince without a seat of power. The night after Laena's funeral, Aemond crept out of the castle. He walked to where Vhagar slept on the shores of Driftmark. He was 13 years old. What followed was, by all accounts, extraordinary. Vhagar woke. She was enormous, large enough to swallow a horse whole, old enough to remember Visenya Targaryen. She roared. She spread wings that could blot out the sky. She was furious at being disturbed, and Aemond Targaryen screamed back at her. He refused to run. He held his ground. He screamed until she quieted, and then, trembling, he climbed onto her back. She flew. That night also cost Aemond his eye. When Laena's children and their cousins, including Lucerys Velaryon, discovered what he had done, a fight broke out. Lucerys cut Aemond's eye out with a knife. Aemond would wear a sapphire in the socket from that day forward. He called it a fair trade. He had lost an eye. He had gained the largest living dragon in the world. Aemond grew into one of the most formidable warriors of his age. He trained obsessively, at swordsmanship, at combat, at riding. He became known as Aemond One-Eye, and while his mother and brothers represented the Greens in the civil war brewing between the two Targaryen factions, Aemond was the weapon, and Vhagar was the blade. When the dance of the dragons erupted after the death of King Viserys, it was Aemond and Vhagar who prosecuted the Green cause with terrifying efficiency. Aemond flew Vhagar over the riverlands and burned towns that dared declare for the Blacks. He razed Harrenhal, a fortress already infamous for its Targaryen fire, not once, but with such thoroughness that the ruination was complete. He called himself Aemond Dragonbane after the events that followed. The most notorious act of Aemond's war was the death of Lucerys Velaryon, the very boy who had cut out his eye. Lucerys was on a diplomatic mission, flying his young dragon Arrax over Shipbreaker Bay near Storm's End. Aemond followed on Vhagar. What happened next is disputed. Aemond claimed he only meant to chase Lucerys, to terrify him, to humiliate him. But Vhagar was ancient, and Vhagar was vast. When Arrax panicked and turned to breathe fire, Vhagar's response was the response of a creature that had survived 2 centuries by eliminating threats. She killed Arrax. She killed Lucerys Velaryon. This single act, the death of a teenage boy on a diplomatic mission, ended any hope of peace between the Blacks and the Greens. The dance of the dragons was no longer a political dispute. It was a war. The death of Vhagar is one of the most dramatic moments in the entirety of Fire and Blood. It came above the God's Eye, the vast lake in the heart of the Riverlands, with the Isle of Faces in its center, where the first men and the children of the forest had made their great pact thousands of years before. The combatants, Aemond Targaryen on Vhagar versus Daemon Targaryen on Caraxes. Both men knew what they were doing. Daemon flew deliberately into territory Aemond controlled. He was issuing a challenge. Aemond accepted. What followed was a battle in the sky above a sacred lake between 2 of the most dangerous men in Westeros, riding 2 of the oldest and most powerful dragons alive. Caraxes was called the Bloodworm. He was lean and serpentine, savage and fast, with a neck longer than most dragons' bodies. He was lethal. Vhagar was twice his size, but size does not always win. Daemon Targaryen, now in his late 50s, waited until the dragons locked together in their aerial struggle, until Caraxes had wrapped around Vhagar like a serpent around prey. And then he leapt. He leapt from Caraxes' back onto Vhagar. He drove his Valyrian steel sword, Dark Sister, the very blade that had once belonged to Visenya Targaryen, Vhagar's first rider, through Aemond's remaining eye. And then he fell. Both dragons plummeted. Both crashed into the god's eye. Caraxes survived the impact, barely, and dragged himself to shore, where he died of his wounds shortly after. Vhagar sank. Aemond's body was recovered from the lake, the sword still buried in his skull. Daemon's body was never found. The greatest dragon alive since the death of Balerion, the Black Dread, was gone. She had lived through the conquest, through the reigns of 5 kings, through nearly 200 years of history. She died in a lake. 5 riders, 5 lives. Visenya Targaryen, who forged a kingdom on her back. Baelon the Brave, who was loved and then lost. Laena Velaryon, who chose fire over a slow death. Aemond One-Eye, who traded an eye for the mightiest weapon in the world and used it. And Daemon Targaryen, who claimed her not through bonding, but through killing her rider in the sky. Vhagar was, in many ways, the dragon that defined the Targaryen age. Balerion began it. Drogon, centuries later, would remind the world what dragons were capable of. But Vhagar lived in it. She survived long enough to become a symbol of power that every dragon rider coveted and every enemy feared. She was never just a dragon. She was history with wings. And when she sank beneath the god's eye, she took with her the last living link to Aegon's conquest. The world was smaller for it. This has been Riders of Vhagar. If you want to read the full account yourself, George R.R. Martin's Fire and Blood covers the history of the Targaryen dynasty from the conquest through the aftermath of the Dance of the Dragons. Every word of this is drawn from that world. And it is extraordinary.